Hello, my wonderfully drowsy time travelers, my fellow lovers of slow, moving history and stories that melt your mind into dreams. Before we begin our journey to the distant past, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If these sleepy stories help you drift off, consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us create more content to lull restless minds to sleep. And if you're feeling extra cozy, leave us a comment. Tell us how long you lasted before dozing off. We love reading your experiences. Now, find your most comfortable position. Let your eyelids grow heavy and allow my voice to guide you into relaxation. What do stones remember of the hands that lifted them? What rests beneath the echo of forgotten footsteps? Welcome to Sleepy Chronicles, where history rests in whispers, beneath the soft folds of twilight, where Rome once grew from the breath of 7 hills. There lay a low. It was not yet called the Colosseum. It was not yet stone or spectacle. It was simply land soft and waterlogged, where time passed slowly, and the air smelled faintly of damp leaves and iron-rich earth. Cattle had once grazed there. Earlier still, Nero had filled it with the glint of his private lake, its surface still as a mirror, holding clouds and secrets alike. But the lake was drained. The empire, hungering for symbols, longed for something more solid than a reflection. Something made not of vanity, but of stone and echo and public awe. And so they chose the hollow, not for its beauty, nor for its view, but because it was available, because it could be taken, carved, pressed, measured. And so the measuring began. In the dimness of morning, long before sun filtered through tiled roofs, men with plumb lines and knotted cords paced the site. Sand stuck to their calves. They spoke softly, not out of reverence, but because it was too early for voices. They marked points in the earth silent, temporary intentions that would one day hold thousands. There was no ceremony, no herald, only ropes, stakes, and chalk lines. The lake bed began its slow forgetting. Soon came the sounds, not the roaring kind, not yet but quiet strikes. Wooden mallets tapping survey poles into place, rustling of linen tunics, shovel blades piercing loam. In corners of the field, birds took brief flight, unsettled by the low rhythm of change. It was Vespasian who commissioned it, though he would never see its completion. A practical man, heavy in gait and lean in ambition, he wished to gift the people a spectacle of their own, something grand, yes, but also grounded. The Flavian Amphitheater, they would call it in time, but not yet. The earth had to be persuaded first. Laborers dug trenches in measured arcs, their spades revealing soil in layers, like pages of a damp book. Some pages were redder than others. Some had roots twisting through them like veins. In places, they found bits of brick from old fires, lost bones, chips of amphorae, whispers of lives built before. None of it stopped the work. All was pushed aside, piled neatly, and carted away. Foundations came slowly, though the empire could be swift. Deep, deliberate holes were sunk, then filled with a dense brew of rubble and lime. Pozzolana volcanic ash from Campania was poured into the mixture, binding it like memory clings to names. The Romans understood concrete not as innovation, but as inevitability. Once it cured, it would never yield. Days blended. Workers rose with the sun and moved like clockwork across the site, their sweat mixing with dust, their backs marked by the sun's patient cruelty. From above, it might have looked like an elaborate dance measured, repetitive, yet purposeful. But on the ground, it was simply effort, quiet, persistent effort. At night, the hollow settled back into silence. Torches flickered along scaffolds. Shadows shifted across unfinished arcs. And still the stones came. Quarried from the distant hills of Tivoli, the travertine arrived in slow processions. Blocks stacked onto wooden carts, drawn by oxen, with sad, patient eyes. Each block bore tool marks, grooves where wedges had been driven, splinters from its reluctant parting with the mountain. They were lifted by rope, turned by lever, whispered into place, not by shouts, but by signals, nods, gestures, hands on stone. A ring began to form, not yet recognizable as a theater. It curved in cautious precision, forming the first of many concentric walls. No detail was rushed. Openings were measured to align with cardinal directions. Arches were placed not just for beauty, but for strength. Everything pointed inward, toward what would one day be the heart, the arena, but would come later. Now it was earth and labor, string lines and quiet breath. The rising walls were not yet walls, but intentions. Each layer of stone was joined not only by mortar, but by hands, calloused, unrecorded hands that placed each block, brushed away the dust, and moved on. Somewhere in the distance, the Tiber flowed without concern. The markets of Rome bustled, unaware of what was forming in their midst. Senators schemed, bakers baked, mothers scolded sons, and in the hollow, the skeleton of something vast slowly took shape, bone by bone. It was never meant to be quiet, but in its making, it was. Even the gods watched without comment, and so the first arc was drawn, a shape made not in celebration, but in certainty, a hushed beginning to a thunderous future. But the thunder would wait. Now there were only ropes and hammers and stone and the long breath of a city, settling itself into something unforgettable. The rain fell lightly in the early hours, beating on the edges of scaffolding and softening the dust beneath the workers' feet. Rome had a way of waking slowly, its temples and courtyards still asleep beneath the weight of clouds, while down in the hollow, men had already returned to their patient rhythm. They carried tools dulled from use, ropes thickened with wear, and minds accustomed to measuring the world, not in thoughts, but in spans of stone. No blueprints guided them, no parchment unrolled with crisp plans. Instead, geometry lived in the calloused memory of surveyors, and in the tug of weighted lines, arches were drawn in string and shadow before they touched limestone. Every step was part of a sequence unwritten, unwitnessed, passed down through nods and murmurs on other building sites. In other cities, long before this arena began to rise, they measured with groma and dioptra tools, ancient even in their times, sighting distances with patience, confirming alignment with tiny movements of hand and eye. One tilt of the plumb line could adjust the course of an entire corridor. The stone itself demanded it. Travertine was forgiving yet firm, easier to cut than granite, but harder than sandstone. It carried the ghost of ancient seabeds, fossilized ripples of long-dead marine life, now to be shaped into steps and arches. The Romans loved it not for its perfection, but for its endurance. Even after centuries, travertine would not crumble. It would not bend. Like the empire itself, it held its form long after its edges grew worn. Stones were not laid flat in mindless repetition. Each had a role. Some were stretcher blocks, long and strong, bearing the linear load. Others were header blocks, tying inner and outer walls like clasped hands. Still others were voussoirs, wedge-shaped and precise, destined to crown an arch and carry weight without ever needing mortar. It was in these choices, this silent sorting of stone, that architecture emerged from mere assembly. The masons worked in pairs and threes, low voices punctuated by the slow scrape of chisels. They trimmed blocks with iron picks, correcting flaws with taps that echoed like distant footsteps. Dust rose from each corner as surfaces were tested and tested again, then carried to be fitted. Not one block was placed without a pause, a moment to breathe, to check alignment against a string, a rule, the memory of an angle drawn in sand. Their scaffolds, too, were made with care, simple wooden grids of pole and plank, rising with the wall, anchored with wedges and ropes. From afar, they looked like nests or ladders to nowhere, but from within, they were lifelines, paths that carried men upward through unfinished chambers, past silent columns, towards something imagined but not yet seen. Meanwhile, underfoot, another kind of measure was being taken. In the foundation vaults, hidden from the light, engineers laid out corridors in concentric rings, barrel vaults. Those curving tunnels of stone and space would distribute the immense weight of the tiers above. Every curve, every junction was a calculation of balance and compression. There was no decoration, no need for beauty here. Only function calm, relentless and sure. Yet even this had its own quiet grace. The curves matched the curvature of the land, following the topography, not as conquerors, but as careful companions. The ground was not reshaped in violence. It was negotiated with. Where the earth dipped, the vaults dipped. Where it rose, they rose. And between them, passageways stretched like lungs, ready to carry breath and movement through stone. The outer wall began to show its shape. It was not flat, but scalloped, a sequence of open arches stacked 3 stories high. Tuscan columns on the first level plane, sturdy, honest, Ionic on the second slender, a touch of elegance, Corinthian on the third ornate, with curling leaves and silent whispers of Greek influence. Each tier echoed the one below, while adding a soft flourish of ascent. Rome, even in spectacle, honored order, and through it all, there was movement. Wagons rolled in with marble blocks for cladding. Bricks arrived by river, dried in fields outside the city. Lime was carted in heavy sacks, its scent chalky and strong. Water bearers stepped carefully between piles of rubble, refilling buckets as if pouring silence into stone. The construction site was not chaotic. It was steady, a pulse, not a roar. Every piece found its place. Even the mistakes were folded into purpose. A chipped edge meant a tighter seam. Crack redirected load in surprising ways. Nothing was wasted. Stone, once quarried, carried a responsibility to be used well, to last. And through this slow layering of effort, the amphitheater began to gather presence. It was still incomplete, still skeletal, but passers-by began to notice the curve in the sky. They paused at the perimeter, watched the men hoisting ropes, saw the cranes creaking into place, their wooden arms pivoting in the wind like slow branches. Rome had seen temples rise, baths steam, aqueducts stretch, but this was different. This was built not for gods or emperors. It was built for the people. The word arena had not yet taken its final shape, but already, in the dust and design, a space was being drawn where thousands would sit, where moments would unfold, where time itself would gather in rings around sand and shadow. The measures continued, each corner checked, each joint tested, each echo in the vaults measured with the tap of knuckles against stone, not for sound, but for stillness. And beneath it all, the hollow held its breath. By mid-morning, the dust hung low, a veil over everything. It coated tools, clung to tunics, softened the outlines of scaffolds and stone, even the sunlight filtering through Rome's smoky skies seemed quieter here, as if dimmed by the sheer persistence of effort. And within that haze, the amphitheater rose stone by stone, callus by callus, shaped not by command, but by daily repetition. Men labored without audience. Their names would not be carved into triumphal arches or summed in marble halls. Yet it was their backs, bent in rhythm with the city's breath, that gave the Colosseum its form. Some came from the fields, former farmers, whose lands had been swallowed by imperial roads. Others were prisoners of war, brought from Judea after the siege of Jerusalem. Their chains exchanged for chisels, their rebellion turned to labor. Still others were craftsmen by trade, brickmakers from Campania, lime mixers from Ostia, carpenters whose fathers had built ships now measuring staircases into air. They spoke many tongues, though few spoke at all. The work was its own language, tapping of chisels, dragging of sledges, the creak of pulleys under weight. Orders passed in gestures, a raised hand to pause, a snap of fingers for more mortar, a quiet whistle to alert of stone descending. Their lives fit the rhythm of construction. Wake before light, work until dusk, sleep beside stone piles under makeshift tents. The air was dry, filled with the scent of sawdust and lime. It burned the throat if one breathed too deeply. Yet they breathed and worked and moved through the rising tiers with the same precision as the engineers who oversaw them. At the base of the structure, a different kind of labor unfolded. There, beneath the Earth's surface, men carved vaults and tunnels, forming the vast substructure that would one day support the arena's complex underbelly. These were not grand passageways, but low, damp chambers where light barely reached. Lanterns swung from hooks, casting slow arcs of shadow as hands measured stone in the dark. Here, they laid the service corridor's routes for animals, or stage lifts for hidden entrances. The Hypogeum, though not yet named, was being born. Each room had to support not only weight, but timing trapdoors must align with distant cues. Lifts had to rise in silence, every mechanism invisible from above. Wooden pulleys and pivoting arms were tested in makeshift workshops nearby. Carpenters shaved beams down with curved planes, their shavings curling like parchment beside their feet. They drilled holes, smoothed edges, tested friction. They worked not for beauty, but reliability. Each piece of timber they shaped would vanish into the bowels of the arena, its movement masked by roar and dust and distance. It had to work, and it had to last. Above, in the open air, masons continued the slow climb of arches. They used no mortar between certain stones, relying on weight and shape alone. Each voussoir, those wedge-shaped blocks that formed the top of an arch, had to be exact. The keystone, placed last, bore the pressure of all others. Once in place, the arch could support staggering loads. They were marvels, not of decoration, but of balance and trust. As the walls grew, the scaffold towers grew with them. Men climbed with baskets of tools, their sandals worn smooth, their hands rope-burned and calloused. They ate at the edge of platforms, legs dangling above columns, not yet finished. Meals were simple bread, olives, dried figs, and always quiet. There was no ceremony here, no speeches of glory, no wine passed between toasts, just food and dust, and a view of Rome slowly shifting beneath them. By late afternoon, the sun turned the stone pale gold. The arches cast longer shadows, and within those shadows, children sometimes appeared curious, peering between wooden barriers. Watching the men at work, they saw little of the grandeur to come. They saw ropes, sweat, chipped rock, but even they sensed something was forming here, something vast and strange. And in the minds of the laborers, a silent question often passed. Who would sit here, in these seats we lay? Who would walk the corridors we carve? Who would cheer above the trapdoors we now fit into place? They would never know. The arena was not for them, but they built it anyway, not out of loyalty or pride, but because labor was the language they had been given, and in each blow of the mallet, In each cartload of stone moved from quarry to arch, they spoke it clearly. Even the smallest tasks mattered. The sweeping of dust, the sharpening of blades, the dampening of lime pits to keep mortar pliable. Each job folded into another until, together, they became the unseen scaffold of the structure itself. And the amphitheater rose, not quickly, but surely, not in spectacle, but in layers of effort. Every wall remembered the hands that pressed its bricks into place. Every arch bore the rhythm of lifting, balancing, settling. By night, the sight fell still again, only the faint crackle of torches, the murmur of men folding cloths over weary shoulders, the soft thud of hammer left in a wooden bucket. Even the dust seemed to settle, resting on stone like a second skin. The moon passed overhead, casting long lines through the arches. The amphitheater, still unfinished, still unnamed, lay beneath it. Not as a monument, but as a quiet promise, one formed in sweat, in dust, in shadows beneath rising stone. At the center of the vast open ring, the morning mist hovered, caught between tiers of stone, still under construction, and a pale hush of a Roman dawn. It drifted along unfinished corridors, coiled gently around columns, and vanished between shadows, where scaffold beams crossed like ribs. The Colosseum, though not yet called, that had begun to resemble itself, not in grandeur, but in rhythm. From the lowest levels, the first full rings of arches had been completed. They curled along the amphitheater circumference, not as mere decoration, but as the breathing framework of a vast and living thing. Each arch served a purpose, channeling weight down into the substructure, holding open space for entrances, and guiding light into the depths. They had built it from the bottom up, ring by ring, each layer smaller in diameter than the last, as if the structure were reaching toward the sky in measured steps. The arches, when viewed from across the forum, appeared weightless. Their symmetry tricked the eye, giving the illusion of softness. But step beneath them, and the reality settled in. These were immense spans of carved travertine and tuff, each block set precisely, joined by nothing more than friction, gravity, and ancient Roman confidence. They were not the arches of a temple, meant for reverence. They were the arches of a machine. Beneath their shadows, workers continued without pause. They wore linen wrapped at the waist, damp from sweat and dust, with sandals reinforced by leather straps. Many had scars where stone had slipped, where chisels had grazed flesh, but they did not pause to admire the rising curve of their creation. Their attention was fixed on the next block, the next rung of the scaffold, the next rope to hoist a stone. Every detail had to be aligned. If an arch was off by even a finger's width, it would throw the tier above into error. So the workers paused, often resting hands on stone, squinting upward along plumb lines weighted with lead. They tapped the sides of blocks with wooden mallets, listening for the sound of alignment, the hollow note of a void meant to be filled, the solid thud of perfect contact. The engineers, robed and precise, walked slowly through the rising corridors with tablets of wax and stylus. They did not shout, they observed, and with short gestures they instructed an arch to shift slightly, a vault to realign, a join to re-mortar. Their presence brought no fear, only focus. This tier would hold the vomitoria, those curving passageways that spilled tens of thousands into the seats, and just as quickly emptied them back out. Despite the name, there was no vulgarity in them. They were marvels of engineering, designed to guide crowds through darkness into the light of the arena, and then back again, through arch and shadow, into the calm beyond spectacle. Above, the upper stories rose in sequence. Each carried its own order of columns and ornamentation. A deliberate architectural hierarchy. The first tier, solid and broad, rested on Tuscan columns plain, unadorned, like the hands that built them. The second tier, lighter, embraced the Ionic, with soft curls and refined curves. Third, highest tier, bore Corinthian columns, slender and crowned with acanthus leaves, a gentle nod to beauty among the geometry. These were not flourishes for nobles. They were for Rome herself, a city that demanded order, even in spectacle. Cranes creaked along the rim, their pulleys wound with thick hemp rope. They lifted not just stone, but beams of cedar imported from Lebanon. These timbers would form the bones of the upper colonnades, and later support the great retractable awning, the velarium that would shade the spectators from sun and rain alike. The velarium's anchoring points were being carved now, holes cut into the stone ring at the very top. Sailors, skilled in ropes and rigging, would one day manage the vast canvas, drawing it open like the wings of a sleeping bird, folding and unfolding it with the wind. But would come later. Now, it was still stone, and dust, and labor, and yet, as the arches multiplied, and the rings curved ever upward, the amphitheater began to hum with its own quiet logic. It was no longer a hollow. It had become a form, a shape the city could not ignore. Even passers-by who had once barely glanced toward the construction now slowed as they approached. They craned their necks. Children whispered beneath the scaffold edge. Vendors paused their calls to observe the rhythm of ropes swinging, blocks rising, men moving like ants along the walls of something impossible. It was not beauty that drew them. It was the sheer weight of purpose, and that purpose echoed in every ring. Inside, the acoustics were being tested not with instruments, but with footsteps. A single walker on the upper tier would produce a soft reverberation far below. Whispers shared beneath an arch could be heard across the row. This was no accident. The engineers had measured sound in curves, drafted silence into stone. No word, once spoken here, would be truly lost. At the end of the day, the arches caught the amber light of dusk. Their shadows fell long across the stonework below. Workers descended slowly, one hand on the rope rails, the other wiping sweat from their brow. Some carried their tools wrapped in cloth. Others left them tucked beneath the scaffolds, trusting the silence of the night to guard them. Torches were lit. They flickered against the walls, casting shifting silhouettes of arch after arch, ring after ring, like a dream, half-formed and steadily becoming real. Rome, at last, was beginning to believe in what was rising, and though it was not yet finished, its echo was already being written into the stone, long before the roar of crowds would ever ripple through the arches, before wild beasts were led into the arena, or emperors raised their hands in judgment. The Colosseum stood upon foundations sunk inside the glory that Rome would later claim of 50,000 spectators seated in perfect tears, of thunderous cheers rising like ocean waves, had no place here in the cool and measured quiet beneath the surface. This was not the realm of celebration. This was the realm of weight. Stone must rest on something stronger than spectacle. The substructures, laid brick by brick, row by patient row, formed the true backbone of the amphitheater. They were unseen, largely forgotten, and yet everything above them depended on their stillness. The foundations were not dug in haste. Each trench was measured with a mason's eye and an engineer's hand. Tall, narrow channels ran across the old lake bed, now dry and firm after years of sun and draining. The soil here was deceptive soft at the surface, but hiding a stubborn depth. Pickaxes met with resistance. Water seeped from old veins, as if the land itself remembered the lake and wished to hold on. But the Romans knew how to negotiate with the earth. They laid deep beds of concrete, using pozzolana, a fine volcanic ash from distant Campania mixed with slaked lime and broken stone. The result was a mass that hardened even under water, settling into the soil like a promise. Over this, courses of brick were laid, each one angled, staggered, tied back to the walls with stone ribs. These were not places meant to be seen, but to endure. Daylight rarely reached here. Lanterns burned at all hours, carried by laborers who ducked beneath arches, their sandals scraping softly across packed soil. They worked in long shifts, the air still and heavy. Their hammers echoed strangely, not sharply, but as muffled heartbeats beneath the construction above. It was here that the pulse of the building truly began. The foundations did more than carry weight. They framed space. They set the limits. They whispered to every column and arch above, "You may rise only as far as we hold you." And so the work here, though hidden, was sacred in its own way, silent, undeniable. In these vaulted underlayers, a system of passageways had begun to take shape. Curving corridors wound beneath where the arena floor would one day be. Though no spectator would ever see them, these were the routes for gladiators to wait in the half-dark, for cages to roll quietly into place, for trapdoors to lift and lower in synchronized silence. The design was purposeful, planned down to the cubit. Yet no one celebrated these tunnels. They were not triumphal. They were necessary, and necessity has its own kind of beauty. Bricklayers, working by the light of oil lamps, moved with practiced grace. Their trowels left clean trails in the mortar. Their hands smoothed joints with care. They bent over rows for hours, pressing clay-fired bricks into place, stepping back, nodding, moving on. They left behind arches that would never be seen again, roofs that would hold the arena above, like cupped palms. Outside, above the ground, the outer facade continued to grow layer by layer, arch by arch, and yet it was these foundations that made each tier possible. Without the quiet strength below, the grandeur above would crumble. Few pause to think of that. Few ever do. The spectators who would someday fill the stone seats would marvel at the lions, at the banners, at the sheer magnitude of the arena, but they would not see the weight carried by the bricks laid in shadow. They would not feel the slope of a corridor measured by candlelight, the steady angle of a drain carved to redirect floodwater. They would never know the names of the men who bent beneath this weight, who wiped their foreheads on sleeves darkened with lime, who whispered to one another in languages lost to the upper world. But the stone remembered. It held their work. Every corridor beneath the seats bore the curve of someone's arm, the imprint of someone's hand on half-set mortar, the mark of a tool used beyond its prime. And those marks remained long after the cheers had faded from the tiers above. The Romans believed in permanence. Their buildings were not simply spaces, they were declarations. Even the parts no one would see had to be perfect, measured, whole, because one crack in the foundation could ripple upward. One weakness below could bring down triumph above. So they labored, without applause, without spectators, without murals, or statues, or poems written in their name. Through their unseen work, the Colosseum grew. It grew not from glory, but from gravity, from the weight of stone pressed into earth, and from the quiet resolve of hands that built without recognition. Above, the arches cast longer shadows. The outer curve of the amphitheater was nearly complete, and sunlight began to move across its face in sweeping arcs. Rome was watching now, more closely than before. Senators discussed its shape. Children played near its base. Markets adjusted their stalls to be nearer its edge. But beneath, the work continued, as it always had, in silence, in shadow, in stone. Before any stone was placed, before a single arch reached toward the Roman sky, there were the lines, faint, careful, intentional, drawn with charcoal and chalk, marked on wax tablets, on sand, on stretched vellum, carried in the minds of those who measured the world, not in grandeur, but in proportions. They were the draftsmen. They were the draftsmen, quiet, steady, often overlooked. They did not lay bricks, nor hoist pulleys, nor mix mortar with bare hands. Their tools were different simple lengths of cord, straight rules of ivory, compasses forged from bronze. They did not shout over noise or sweat in the sun. Instead, they crouched near lanterns, hunched over tables made of cedar, scratching numbers and lines as the city churned beyond the canvas walls. In this rising monument, they were its earliest voice. The Colosseum, like all Roman works of scale, had to begin in the abstract. Curves imagined before they curved, weights predicted before they pressed down. And so the draftsmen gathered beneath awnings in the corner of the site, quietly working long before scaffolds ever touched the sky. They spoke in murmurs, exchanged rolls of papyrus like secrets, and worked not in haste, but in rhythm, each stroke of the stylus reinforcing the last. They measured ratios with delicate hands, drew concentric rings to guide the placement of seats, angled corridors like sun rays, all pointing toward the same sandy center. The arena itself, the heart of the Colosseum, was an ellipse calculated with care, not too wide, for sound would scatter, not too narrow, for movement would be trapped. Its shape guided by acoustics, by vision, by the path of sun and shadow. They mapped it in the soil first, laying cords on pegs driven into the earth. One end anchored, the other walked in an arc, marking distances by step and by string. The ellipse was drawn not once, but dozens of times, until it fit, until the geometry felt natural. The tiers of seating were likewise modeled in miniature, tiny steps carved from wax, miniature columns fashioned from reeds. They watched how light moved across them, how shadows fell between tiers. They tilted the model gently, imitating the rise of the morning sun, predicting how the real light would stretch across marble when finished. They understood that space had moved, that an entrance too narrow could cause dread, that stairs too steep would strain the legs of senators, that if one sat in the highest tier, they must still feel connected to the roar below. And so they drafted it all. The vomitoria, those exit corridors sweeping inwards like ocean currents, the radial staircases fanning gently from center to rim, placement of entrances aligned with compass points and wind patterns, every turn, every shadow, every beam of light, drawn before it was built. It was their math, their vision, that shaped the work of thousands. The engineers consulted them often. They pored over sketches together, hands tracing lines mid-air, eyebrows furrowed in thought. Adjustments were made slowly. A staircase shifted by 2 degrees, a wall realigned to correct a ripple in stone. The draftsmen did not insist. They suggested, quietly, but their suggestions often held. They rarely touched the construction itself. Instead, they listened to how wind passed through arches, to how the ground echoed underfoot, to how the columns whispered back when tapped. Some stood at the edges of the rising tiers, hands tucked behind backs, watching as blocks were set into place exactly as their sketches dictated. And sometimes, not exactly, a sigh escaped them when a curve was too sharp, a raised brow when a beam rested unevenly. But still, they said nothing. They simply returned to their tablets and made a note. Their names were not carved into cornerstones. No statue honors them beside the arena. Yet their legacy lies in every perfect arc, every seat that aligns with the sun, every corridor that flows without confusion. They wrote no poetry, but they carved silence into geometry, and when the amphitheater began to speak, when sound would someday erupt from tens of thousands, they knew that even the noise would carry their measure. By evening, When the workers descended the scaffolds and the masons wiped dust from their arms, the draftsmen remained seated beneath flickering lamplight, a new sketch unfurled before them, this time for the trapdoors that would lift creatures into view. They measured the space beneath the sand, calculating the rise, the pressure, the counterweight required. Not one line was careless, not one angle without intent. They were not builders of walls, but of the spaces between them. They gave form to what could not be seen. Not yet, and in doing so, they guided every hand that came after. So much of the Colosseum remains today, but its truest endurance may be the precision that holds it together. A precision born in the minds of quiet men with steady hands and long patience. Far from Rome, beyond the bend of the Tiber and the reach of its marble fingers, the hills of Tivoli lay in stillness, mottled with scrub and stone. There, in the open embrace of the Sabine landscape, great wounds were opened in the earth, cut clean into hillsides, their edges raw with chisels and dust. These were the travertine quarries, and it was here that the bones of the Colosseum were first awakened. The arena story did not begin with arches, nor with seats, nor even with blueprints. It began here, where stone first met sunlight. The quarry was not loud, not in the way one might imagine. There were no shouts, no clash of iron against iron. Instead, there was rhythm, a low, steady beat of mallet against wedge, the whisper of soles drawn across limestone, the occasional sigh of oxen waiting beside heavy carts. Men moved slowly, not out of laziness, but care. The stone demanded it. Travertine was both generous and stubborn, softer than granite, but firmer than tough, strong but not brittle. Its color shifted from pale ivory to warm honey, streaked sometimes with iron, sometimes with tiny fossilized shell. To the quarrymen, each block was a choice, not just where to cut, but how. They began with marks lines drawn in charcoal or scored with knives. These were not decorative, but promises. They indicated where the wedges would go, where the stone might split clean, or where it might fight back. Each block began as part of a cliff, and each separation was a negotiation. Iron wedges were hammered into narrow holes in sequence, gently at first, then with force. Tap, tap, dot, pause. Tap, tap, dot, wait. I'll. Then, with a creak, a pop, a reluctant sigh, the stone surrendered. A section split free, revealing a face untouched by time, soft to the eye and clean to the hand. The workers examined it, sometimes nodding, sometimes murmuring a disappointment that only quarrymen could understand. If it was sound, if it bore no fault lines, no hidden veins of clay, it would be taken. Otherwise, it remained a silent flaw beneath the surface. Once accepted, the block was trimmed, not with saws, but with chisels and wedges, shaped into rough cubes or slabs, depending on its purpose. Columns demanded length, arches needed wedges, walls wanted breadth. Each purpose dictated a cut, and each cut was made by hand. The carts arrived next. Wooden frames creaked under the weight. Oxen were yoked in pairs, their hides flecked with dust, their steps slow but certain. Ramps had been carved into the quarry walls, gentle slopes that allowed descent and ascent without panic. Even the paths were considered, shaped by the engineers who understood that stone was heavy and time was slow. Each cart was loaded with care. Ropes lashed the blocks, padding, old cloth, straw. Even leather was wedged between stone and frame to prevent cracking. Then began the journey to Rome, a slow, deliberate path that wound through countryside and village, sometimes over hills, sometimes along the river. In dry seasons, the carts kicked up plumes of dust that hung behind them like veils. In the wet, they sank into mud, wheels turning with effort, each revolution a quiet testament to endurance. People along the road watched the stone pass, whispering to one another. Even they knew its purpose. The arena, after all, was a public work. Its story spread before its walls even rose. That stone, they said, will one day hold the emperor's gaze. That block will echo with lions. That slab will remember cheers. But the stone knew none of this. It knew only sunlight, weight, and waiting. By the time it reached the city, its edges were worn smooth from the road. It was offloaded near the site, stacked in measured rows, marked with symbols, chalk lines, scribed letters, signs only the foreman understood. Then it waited again. Not all blocks were placed immediately. Some waited weeks, others months. Rain fell over them. Dust coated their faces. But they did not complain. They were patient. They had been beneath the earth for millennia. A few more weeks meant little. When at last they were lifted by crane, by ramp, by pulleys, they became part of something new. Laid into arches, shaped into steps, carved into columns, polished into thresholds. Their memories of the quarry faded beneath the chisels, beneath the tread of sandals, beneath the cheers that would come. But in the quiet of the night, when the construction paused, and the fires burned low, and the city held its breath, the stone still remembered the tap of wedges, the hush of wind across the quarry face, the rhythm of work, the rhythm that began it all, before the stone could settle into its final form, before arches could stretch and vaults could breathe. Another material was needed, one softer to the touch, but just as essential. Timber, long, straight, and seasoned by distance. The stone gave the Colosseum its weight. The timber gave it its reach, not just for scaffolds and ramps, but for formwork, wooden molds that guided the setting of arches, supported fresh mortar, and lent shape to the vaults until the stone could bear itself. Wood was the quiet companion of stone, always present, always temporary. But Rome's own forests could not meet the demand. The empire turned outward. Ships arrived at Ostia, the bustling port at the mouth of the Tiber. They carried beams from forests far beyond the city's walls. From the Apennines came chestnut and oak, straight and dense, from the slopes of gall, pine and fir, stripped of bark and cured in smoke. And from the great cedar groves of Lebanon came the longest timbers sought after for centuries, sacred in story, now destined for the underpinnings of Roman spectacle. The logs were floated down rivers where they could, or dragged by carts and animal teams overland. Their bark was long stripped, their ends painted with marks that told handlers where they were to go vault formwork, roof trusses, or crane assemblies. Some timbers bore the same journey as slaves and goods, crossing seas and climbing hills just to be hidden behind stone. Once in Rome, they were sorted and stacked, shaded from the sun, watered if needed to prevent cracking. Carpenters moved among them with adzes and augers, smoothing edges, boring holes, measuring lengths against known spans. No blueprints were needed, only memory. These men did not read plan. They read the wood. They knew by scent if it had seasoned well. They could hear by knock if it would split under pressure. They could see in the grain whether it would bend with tension or shatter under load. Their tools were sharp, their movements slow. Each cut carried intention. Scaffolds came first, rising with the arena walls. These wooden lattices climbed tier by tier. They were assembled not as random frames, but as careful systems load-bearing, braced and tied. Atop them, workers walked and hauled, using the timbers as pathways into the sky. The scaffold creaked, but held. It bent, but did not break. Then came the formwork. To shape a vault, one needed a mold. Carpenters built curved frames, wooden ribs that echoed the desired arc. Across these, they laid planks, fixed tight with wooden pegs. Over this structure, masons laid bricks in fans, one by one, mortared in place. When the vault had set, the wood was struck, gently removed, leaving behind only air and curve. Some of this timber was reused, some burnt as firewood, but much of it remained, hidden forever within the walls. A support beam encased in concrete, a joint left beneath a stair, a gotten brace in a tunnel where no light would reach again. And then there were the cranes. These were machines of wood, simple, elegant, functional, vertical masts anchored into stone, pivoting arms controlled by rope and pulley, all powered by muscle, sometimes by counterweight, sometimes by the strength of men walking within giant wooden wheels. Tread wheels like silent mills, rotating slowly to lift blocks of stone skyward. It was wood that bore the strain. It groaned beneath the load, flexed under tension, and still it held. Even the seating rows the cavia relied on timber, though most would be finished in stone or marble. The substructure was often wooden. Beams rested atop brick, supporting platforms where viewers would someday sit. Engineers planned it all, but it was carpenters who gave it breath. At night, the smell of sawdust lingered over the site, not unpleasant, warm, earthy, mixed with smoke and sweat. Torches flickered against scaffold poles, their light chasing along grain and knot. Men sat on planks, wiping hands on tunics, tracing the curls of shavings at their feet like parchment scrolls. They did not speak much. They didn't need to. Their work was not just construction, it was conversation. Between timber and hand, between tool and grain, between weight and support. It was understood. When the sun returned, the work resumed. The scaffolds creaked again. The ropes pulled again. The wheels turned again. The timbers had come from afar. Now, they were part of something larger than grove or forest. Now they served not trees, but arches, not sky, but amphitheater. And though few would remember the beams once they were sealed in stone, the structure would always rely on them. In every lifted vault, in every seated tier, in every echo that rose and vanished into space, there was wood beneath the roar. By now, the Colosseum had claimed the skyline. Its arches wrapped the horizon. Its tiers rose in elegant measure. And from the outermost rim, one could look across rooftops and temples, across the curl of the Tiber, even toward the hills where stone had once slept in the earth. But this was not the end. There was still a ceiling to shape, a sky to lift. For as vast as the amphitheater had become, it remained open to the heavens exposed to sun, to wind, to sudden Roman rain. And for those seated beneath that sky, watching beasts or men below, there would come heat, glare, and dust swirling in midday brightness. The solution was not a roof. It was a sail, the velarium, a retractable awning, impossibly large, stretched over the arena like a breath caught in canvas. Not fixed, not rigid, but alive, able to be drawn open or folded back, depending on the weather, the winds, or the emperor's whim. But to lift the sky, one must first shape the edges of the earth at the very top of the amphitheater, beyond the final row of seating, above the third tier of Corinthian arches. Masons carved sockets into the stone. These recesses, spaced evenly around the rim, were not for decoration. They were anchors for giant masts, each made of wood, each reaching high into the air. The masts would bear ropes, pulleys, and sailcloths. They would lean outward slightly, like trees caught in permanent wind, forming a ring of support around the opening sky. And within the sockets, they had to fit perfectly. Any shift, any slackness could bring the whole system down. The carpenters crafted each mast with care. Straight trunks, shaved smooth, strengthened at the base with bronze or iron bands. Their height was matched to their neighbor, their weight carefully balanced. When set into place, they tilted slightly toward the outer city, creating just enough tension to support the fabric stretched between them. The velarium itself was made of heavy canvas woven tightly, coated in wax or oil to resist water. Its weight was immense, yet it had to be light enough to move, and it had to be silent, or nearly so. A rustling curtain was welcome. A flapping sail in full wind was not. The men who would manage it were not masons, not carpenters, not common laborers. They were sailors, specialized crews, drawn from Rome's own navy, trained in ropes and rigging. They had climbed masts at sea, read the wind by scent, balanced their lives on the motion of lines drawn taut between sky and deck. And now they were called to serve not on ships, but above an arena. They climbed the masts like riggers, tying ropes that ran in long arcs across the opening. Pulleys turned, tested, and tested again. When all was secure, they began to draw the canvas upward, not in one piece, but in segments. The velarium was modular. Like a folded fan, each section could be deployed or withdrawn depending on the angle of the sun, the needs of the day. The canvas stretched slowly into place. It did not cover the entire arena. It framed it like an eyelid half closed, or the palm of a hand offering shade. Sunlight still reached the sand below, but softened, striped now by shadow and light. The spectators would be grateful. Seated in the upper tiers facing the blaze of the noon sun, they would find respite. Their eyes would rest more easily on the contests below. The amphitheater would not only hold them, it would comfort them. To lift the sky was no small feat. Each rope, each cleat, each anchor had to hold. The masts had to stand firm. Canvas could not sag. Sailors had to read wind patterns, anticipate gusts, adjust accordingly. When storms threatened, the velarium was lowered quickly, drawn back like wings folding in retreat. And all of this, the silent labor above the seats, went largely unnoticed by the crowds. To them, it was simply shade, a softening of the light, comfort that arrived and vanished with the breeze. But the engineers knew, the sailors knew, the builders who had carved the sockets, braced the masts, aligned the ropes. They all knew what it meant to hold the sky. And when the wind rose, as it often did in Rome, the velarium responded. It lifted slightly, moved, settled. Its motion was slow, like breathing. Path, lung stretched above stone. A sail without a ship. A ceiling made not to contain, but to ease. In time, poets would write of it. Children would mimic it in games. Foreign visitors would marvel at its scale. But in the years of its making, it was only one more task among many. Yet it changed everything. It turned the amphitheater into something more than stone, gave it softness and motion. In the sky, the Colosseum was nearly whole now. Its outer walls reached full height. Its arches had multiplied into perfect rhythm. The tiers of seating curled inward, like petals of an enormous stone flower. The velarium stood ready to stretch and settle with the changing wind. And yet, in the shadow of all this grandeur, the smallest acts of construction continued. Because in the end, it was not the great blocks alone that made the amphitheater. It was the in-between spaces, the breath held between bricks. Here, in the quieter days of its building, attention shifted inward toward joints, seams, surfaces, toward plaster, paint, mortar lines barely a finger's width wide, toward the spaces where air would move and settle between stone and breath. Bricklayers moved in pairs now, quieter than before, their steps light, their hands was steady. They no longer carried massive blocks, but stacks of slim, baked tiles laters, fired red and orange in the kilns just outside the city. These were not meant to dazzle. They were for the inner walls, the vault linings, the quiet support behind marble and paint. They laid them in herringbone patterns, opus spiccatum, or in clean rows, opus lateritium. Mortar was spread thin, applied not with rush, but precision. Trowels moved in arcs. Edges were tapped into place. From a distance, it was unremarkable, just lines upon lines. But up close, the walls breathed with subtle order. Plasters followed. They mixed lime with water and sand, whisking it to the consistency of cream. Then, with wide brushes and wooden floats, they coated the brick, first roughly, then smoother, then polished to a fine sheen. In some corridors, they added pigments, soft reds, ochres, creams tones that matched the warmth of skin, the flicker of torchlight, the gold of early evening. There were no frescoes, no lavish murals. Not here. These were not palaces. These were passageways, places of movement, of pause, of silence. Still, care was taken. Cracks were filled, curves smoothed, light tested with polished copper mirrors to ensure no corner held sudden darkness. The masons, too, returned to touch up their earlier work. They walked the arches slowly, hands trailing along seams. Loose mortar was removed and replaced. Chips were rounded. Steps were adjusted to reduce rise, so elderly senators might climb more gently. And in the arena's inner ring, the podium, the finishing stones were set with particular care. These were for the most honored guests, magistrates, priests, vestal virgins. Their seats would be closest to the sand, their view unobstructed. Here, the marble was brought in soft, pale, veined with faint hints of rose. It caught the light like water. Each slab was polished with pumice, then oiled to bring out its depth. Not too much, just enough to glow. Ventilation channels were cleared. Next, invisible to the eye, but vital to the comfort of all inside. Narrow ducts carved into walls, covered by perforated bricks or bronze grates. They allowed air to move, to rise and fall with the heat of the day. Without them, the arena would stifle. With them, it breathed. The corridors, those long, echoing passageways, were lined now, not with ornament, but with order. Arches repeated at regular intervals. Niches were framed with plain stone. Numbers were scratched lightly near entrances guides, for stewards who would someday usher crowds with quiet efficiency. There was even thought for sound. The architects knew that the human voice could carry in curves, so they tested it standing at various points, clapping, speaking, listening. Adjustments were made, a lintel raised, a corner rounded, the softest echo tuned, not silenced. And the staircases, the staircases, they spiraled upward in carefully calculated increments. Rise and tread, measured to suit the foot. The flow of thousands. They were made not to impress, but to endure. Bricks lined their undersides. Handholds were carved where space allowed. They were built not for ceremony, but for rhythm. And through it all, the workers remained, not as many as before. The largest crews had dispersed. Some had gone to other projects. Others returned to their farms or their homes beyond the city walls. But a few remained. The finishers, the takers, the ones who had begun this thing and would see it through to the last breath between the bricks. At the end of each day, they stood back, not in awe, but in quiet confirmation. A new section polished, a vault complete, a stairwell swept, each detail folded into the whole like threads into cloth. No one applauded, but the silence held its own kind of reverence. Rome bustled just beyond the walls. Markets rang with voices. Temples filled with prayer. Messengers ran down avenues. But inside the arena, the light moved gently across the stone, touched the finished seats, curled along the arches. It slipped through the corridors like a sigh, and the building breathed, not with drama, but with presence, kind of presence that lives in the iron, in between weight and lift, between effort and ease, between stone and air, between each brick a breath. The arena floor, at last, was ready to take its shape. All the stone, all the timber, all the brick, and lime had built toward this the central stage, the place where footsteps would, but even here, even now, the construction whispered forward slowly, gently, not as climax, but as continuation. The arena was not a pit, it was a surface, a veil stretched across unseen chambers. The floor itself was not solid. Beneath it lay the hypogeum, a labyrinth of corridors, cages, pulleys, and hidden doors. Workers, some of them laboring by torchlight, had carved the underground levels with precision. Narrow walkways crisscrossed the space like capillaries. Wooden lifts sat within brick shafts, waiting to rise. Gates, operated by iron levers, clanked softly open and shut. But from above, none of this would be seen. To the spectator, the arena was simplicity. A flat oval of pale sand, and yet that sand had purpose. It was layered first with compacted earth, then covered with a mixture of crushed limestone and volcanic ash sand lime, which offered grip and cushioning. A surface over this, the arena was dressed in fine sand, freshly delivered from the riverbanks, sifted and pale. It held the light, it hushed sound, it showed every trace of movement. Footprints lingered there longer than they should, fading only when swept. A dropped helmet left a shallow dent. A lion's paw, padded and silent, could be seen long after it had passed. In the mornings, attendants would rake the surface smooth. They moved quietly, walking backwards, dragging wide combs in straight lines. Their work was not unlike that of gardeners. shaping patterns that would soon be disturbed. Some added oil to keep the dust out. Others poured new sand by hand, one basket at a time, where marks had become too deep. And in the center of it all, stillness, the arena floor, empty, untouched, was vast. Its boundaries were low walls of polished stone, designed not to separate, but to contain. Bronze railings marked the edge where the podium began. Torches were placed at intervals, though rarely lit daylight, and soon the press of thousands would provide enough brightness. There were trapdoors, some small, square, flush with the floor, others wider, framed with hidden joints. They blended with the sand, invisible until open. Below them, platforms could rise, lifts powered by pulleys and counterweights, operated by teams working in the dark. A bear, a chariot, a tree, whatever the spectacle called for, could appear as if from nothing. Yet now, there was nothing, only the quiet floor, only the soft drag of sand line, only the memory of the footsteps that had tested it. For in these final weeks before opening, the builders themselves had walked here, not for ceremony, but for calibration. Engineers stepped across the length of the arena, checking the rise of the podium, the alignment of corridors. Sailors adjusted velarium lines from above, their shadows long on the sand. A few children of laborers, brought to the site for a final glimpse, ran laughing in circles, their tracks the first ever left here. No one stopped them. The Colosseum, after all, was built for people, and though its future would be filled with contests, conflict, and cheers, in these last quiet days, it belonged still to the builders, to their families, to the rhythm of footsteps, not for show, but for memory. The walls held the sound. If one stood near the edge of the arena, listening carefully, one could hear more than the city beyond. There was a hum, faint, low, constant, the resonance of arches, the breath of bricks, the slow exhale of stone settling into its final shape. Some of the older workers stood there too, hands behind their backs, heads tilted slightly. They said little, just watched the light move across the sand, perhaps thinking of the quarry, or the climb of the scaffold, or perhaps nothing at all, just the piece of something finished. Yet it wasn't finished, not quite. There were torches to be fixed, marble to be polished, numbers to be carved into the stone seats. But the floor was ready. The stage had been swept, and for a moment, the Colosseum held its breath, not in waiting for glory, but in quiet gratitude for the footsteps that had tested its weight, for the sand that would soften every sound, for the lime that bound not just bricks, but memory itself. Soon, it would hold thousands, but today, it held only light and the faint marks of feet slowly fading into rest. Morning came gently, as it often did in Rome, with a sky just tinged by rose and a hush that lingered longer than one might expect in a city so alive. But within the stone arms of the Colosseum, that hush found permanence. The arena was ready. The stones had settled. The arches stood quiet and sure. The seats had been swept, the sand raked smooth, and for a moment, an entire morning. Perhaps the great amphitheater stood not as a place of noise, but of stillness. It was, finally, a theater, but not yet of spectacle, not yet of cheering crowds and choreographed violence. Now, it was a theater of silence, even empty. It breathed with presence. Their seats curved with perfect intention. They wrapped around the oval like rings around time itself. Each row a little higher, a little narrower, guiding the eye inward toward the open center. Each seat had been assigned by rank, by class, by duty. Senators near the front, foreign envoys, vestals. Above them, the equestrians. Higher still, the merchants, the citizens, the freedmen, and at the very top, the attic level, stood the poor, the latecomers, the women who were not permitted lower access. But now, there were no divisions, only seats, only rows of stone, empty, waiting. From the podium wall, the view downward was gentle, not steep. The sand glowed in the mid-morning light. It bore the faint trace of a rake's passage, diagonal lines like writing on parchment. In the silence, one could hear distant footsteps from the upper galleries, a wooden gate creaking slightly in the wind, the soft call of a bird overhead. No one sat yet, but the building listened. Down in the corridors, the last stewards walked slowly, testing doors, aligning torches. They spoke in low tones, if at all. Each alcove had been checked, each stair swept. Fresh oil had been poured into lantern bowls. A faint scent of lime still lingered where mortar had dried. Every echo was deliberate. In the vomitoria, the great exit corridors, lights slanted in from arched entryways, soft and golden. The plastered walls reflected it gently. Numbers had been carved in clean Latin script above each door. The numbering was logical, efficient. A citizen of any province could find his seat with ease, guided by the rows of arches that funneled inward like waves. Even the shadows were orderly. The amphitheater was ready to hold more than people. It was ready to hold time. For in this moment, before its first use, before its first cry, it stood at the edge of memory, already ancient in its bones, already shaped by more than labor. It had become a place of rhythm, of air, of pause. The sails of the velarium were stowed today. The sky above was clear. The masts stood tall, their rigging secure. Sailors paced the upper rim, checking lines. Below them, the seats climbed like terraces of quiet anticipation. No wind stirred. From within, a whisper might carry from one end of the arena to the other. The engineers had walked the space that morning, not with instruments, but with instinct. They listened. A footfall on stone, a cough in the corridor, the rustle of a cloak in the upper tier. All were heard. The sound moved as it was meant to, gently, evenly, unbroken. Even the sand had a sound when brushed with a hand, a soft, sifting note, like breath over parchment. Some workers still moved beneath, in the hypogeum, They oiled levers, turned wheels. They tested the trapdoors with slow precision. Not for show, for safety. If a door rose unevenly, if a lift groaned under strain, it was fixed. Nothing rushed, nothing presumed. And all the while, the silence held. A silence not of emptiness, but of fullness. Theater, in waiting, not demanding, not impatient, but certain. The emperor had not arrived, nor had the animals, nor the gladiators. The sand was undisturbed, but the Colosseum was already what it had always been meant to be. A vessel for presence, a space designed not just to contain thousands, but to hold their breath. Even before its first games, it taught Rome something. That architecture, at its highest form, is not just stone, but pause. Not just display, but containment. That even in silence, an arena can roar. But for now, it did not. It simply stood. Oh, wow. Go, waiting and listening. The sun had shifted by midday, casting long, clean shadows across the amphitheaters, stone benches. The seats, over 50,000 of them, curved in steady rhythm. Silent tiers of pale travertine and aged brick, each one waiting to cradle the form of a Roman citizen, a foreign dignitary, a curious traveler. But for now, they held only shadow. There were no robes rustling, no sandals scraping across steps, no hands passing cups of wine, no chatter, no gasps, only the slow motion of light, curling along rows, pausing in hollows, moving on. Each seat had been planned with care. They were carved not with comfort in mind, but with structure, angled just enough to see the arena without leaning, narrow to conserve space, deep enough for the body, but not indulgent. Form followed function. Form always followed function. Yet they were not entirely without consideration. At intervals, rows were broken by staircases, known as cunei wedges of seats that formed neat sections across the curve of the arena. These staircases were wide, their steps shallow, each one flanked by a low wall that guided those who climbed. No one would stumble here, not easily. The engineers had walked the heights themselves, counted the paces, corrected the angle. The lower rows were finer. Closer to the podium, the seats had been polished, marble in many places. Some bore inscriptions, names, offices held. Others had indentations, marks of use, of attendance over time. But now, newly placed, they were blank, smooth, waiting to be worn. As the light passed, each row lit in turn. The sun began with the highest seats, the ones at the very back of the amphitheater. These were for the latecomers, the poor, the outcasts. Their view was wide, but distant. The seats were steep, the steps narrow. Yet from here, the arena was still visible. The sweep of the sand, the distant gestures of combat, the shifting canopy of the velarium, all could be seen from these high shadows. And as the day advanced, the sun moved out, row by row, shadow by shadow, until the inner circle, the podium wall, was lit last. This movement, daily, predictable, gave rhythm to the amphitheater. It was a sundial as much as a stage, and those who would come to sit would learn its moods, its brightness, its angles. But today, the seats were quiet. Dust settled in corners. A few birds circled overhead, wings briefly cutting shadows across the stone. Somewhere, in the upper arcade, a rope creaked gently against its mooring, and far below, the arena floor lay soft and pale. The workers, those few who remained, moved carefully between tiers. They were not cleaning now. They were listening. One stepped onto the highest row and paused, placing his hand flat on the stone. Warm, still. Another walked the lower galleries, trailing his fingers across the inscriptions, reading names he did not know. Another stopped halfway up and sat for just a moment, testing the seat he would never sit in again. These were not spectators. They were builders. But even builders could admire. Even they could feel what the structure had become. A place not just of form, but of experience. A place where people would sit, shoulder to shoulder, breathe together, eyes fixed on the same space. A place of shared silence or shared noise. But today, stillness. There was something sacred in the emptiness. The way the arches held air. The way the steps curved without end. The way the shadows moved gently, almost respectfully, across the rows. The theater did not beg to be filled. It allowed. And the seats, every one of them waited without hurry. They would welcome whatever came. The murmurs of children, the cheers of men, the sobs of loss, the shrill blast of a horn, all of it. They were carved not just to support the body, but to receive presence. And even if no one came, even if for one more day, they held only shadows, they would still be enough. As the sun arced past its zenith and drifted slowly westward, it began to soften, no longer burning but glowing, casting a gentle amber over the curve of the amphitheater. The Colosseum responded in kind. Its stone, warmed throughout the day, now gave back that warmth not in heat, but in color. A golden hush that draped itself over every arch, every tier, every corridor. The light fell like a curtain. It did not demand attention. It settled through the open arches. It spilled quietly onto the inner walls. It climbed the undersides of vaults. It folded across the stone stairs in long, lazy bands, and with it came the smell of lime, faint, chalky, earthy, caught in the mortar joints, in the plaster dust, in the crevices between bricks. The scent was not unpleasant. It was the smell of time passing through stone, of work done and settled, of walls drying in silence after long weeks of careful touch. Lime had been everywhere during construction. It was in the mortar, of course, binding brick to brick, block to block, mixed with pozzolana and water. It hardened beneath the surface into something near eternal. But it was also in the coatings skimmed across interior surfaces, layered onto stairwells, brushed over hidden chambers where no foot might ever tread again. Its color was soft, not white, but whispering white, not brilliant, but quiet. It caught the fading sun beautifully. Along the upper walkways, the plastered walls shimmered faintly with reflected light, not like gold, not like marble, but like parchment, warmed by firelight. There were no frescoes here, no mosaics, but there was texture, smooth, with just enough imperfection to remind you it was made by hands. Hands now long gone. Workers had touched every surface, brushed it, smoothed it, whispered over it, in their own silent language of motion, their fingerprints no longer visible, yet somehow still present, held in the lime, preserved in the angles, remembered in the folds of the corridors where the sun now fell like a veil. The corridors ran long and even, some open to the light, others shaded, their shadows cooling the stone. In these shaded galleries, the lime held a faint dampness, absorbing the day's warmth, waiting to release it slowly through the night. The acoustics were hushed here. Voices fell away quickly, footsteps muffled, and still, above, the light shifted. It dipped below the western rim of the amphitheater, casting the upper arches into silhouette. Long, thin rays slipped between columns, touching only the edges of things, the curve of a railing, the lip of a seat, the edge of a keystone. It was the hour when the Colosseum turned inward, not closed, but quieter. It no longer reached for the sky. It held what it had. It cradled the fading light. The sails of the velarium stirred slightly, though still stowed. A single rope creaked. Somewhere above the attic tier, a bird's shadow passed briefly across the highest arch and vanished. Below, in the hidden places, the lime still clung. In the hypogeum, where light barely touched, its scent was stronger, mixed with damp stone and the slow breath of the earth. Here, torches would someday burn, but today only coolness reigned, quiet, measured space, air that hadn't moved in hours. The engineers walked once more, their last inspection. They passed their palms over the plastered walls, tested handholds in the stairwells, listened, felt. They didn't speak, not now. Their voices would have felt intrusive. The structure didn't need praise. It only needed time, and time had given it form. Above them, the sunlight waned, each moment dimmer than the last. The arches no longer shone. They deepened into amber, then into ash. The limestone walls cooled. The scent of lime began to fade into evening's broader smells, distant fires, street dust. The first notes of nightfall in the city beyond. The curtains were drawn, not of fabric, but of light. The arena did not close. It rested, wrapped in the glow of a day's end, cradled in the lime-dusted arms of arches, folded beneath a sky now turned lavender. And as the last rays slipped below the edge of the western wall, Colosseum sighed, not audibly, not even through stone, but through stillness. It had held the sun and let it go, as it would again. And again, for centuries to come. Evening drew its quiet veil across Rome, but inside the Colosseum, the light had one final task: to find the marble, to pause there before fading and kiss it once more. For marble does not reflect like glass. It glows. It remembers the sun, not in shine, but in presence. And within the great amphitheater, marble had been placed not to dazzle, but to hum. Not all of the Colosseum was clad in it, only in certain places, only where presence demanded permanence. Along the podium, the front ring just above the arena, the seats were carved from thick marble slabs, smooth, solid, cool to the touch. These are not the seats of spectators. They were the seats of symbols. Here sat the emperor, the high priests, the vestals in their white veils. Here sat silence in the midst of future thunder. The marble there was a pale grey, veined faintly with warmer tones, like distant roots beneath a frozen surface. Each seat had been cut from a single block, no joints, no seams, just form, continuous and sure. And yet it pulsed, not with life, but with memory, the kind of memory held in ancient stone, the kind that cannot be seen directly, only felt under a hand, under the hush of early evening, when footsteps grow scarce and the air settles. Elsewhere, the marble had been used sparingly, wisely. Door frames, balustrades, certain risers in the stairways, few panels set into the tribunal, where the magistrates would someday sit in judgment. A statue base here, a plinth there, each placed not to show wealth, but to mark gravity. The workers had placed these pieces with reverence. They had come from Carrara, from Paros, from quarries known by name, to those who understood stone as family, transported over land and sea, shaped slowly, without rush. The polish came last, after all fitting had been done. A mixture of fine pumice, goat's hair brushes, and olive oil brought the surface to light, not gleaming, breathing. The masons had spoken little during installation. They moved as if in a temple, even though they stood in an arena. Every slab was guided by hands, lowered with pulleys, adjusted with wedges. Gaps were invisible, edges softened, just enough to let the finger glide. They worked not to impress, but to last. Marble was not a boast. It was a heartbeat. It gave rhythm to the architecture, to the shadows, to the viewer's eye. Where brick ended, marble began. Where a line receded, marble stepped forward. Where dust settled, marble quietly refused to hold it. In the cavea, the seating bowl's select rows bore marble cladding, but most remained plain. The stone spoke loudest where it whispered, and now, at dusk, that whisper deepened. The marble held the fading warmth of day. If one pressed upon to it, one might feel a coolness beneath the heat layers of temperature, like light trapped under glass, but living in stone. The pulse of it wasn't quick. It was slow, long, like waves against a hollow shore. No audience had yet arrived. Still, the marble knew what was coming. It had been used in temples, in palaces, in baths, but here it waited for something else, not divine worship, but human breath, thousands of voices, the collective gaze of a city. Applause, perhaps, or stillness, or silence even deeper than this one. Down in the corridors, leftover marble dust clung in corners. It shimmered faintly in torchlight, like frost, the scent of stone, sweet and mineral, mingled with the last breaths of drying lime. A mason passed a hand along one of the panels, then nodded. Satisfied, he stepped back. His touch was the last. From this point on, no one would alter. It would be cleaned, certainly, rubbed with cloths, inspected, repaired in centuries yet to come. But the form was now final. The pulse set. The marble stood as witness to footsteps approaching, to banners unfurling, to eyes gazing downward toward the center of the world. But for now, it witnessed only quiet. The arches above it began to darken. The sand below lay untouched, and the stone, polished and precise, glowed faintly with its own light, not from the sun, but from having held it, not from fire, but from having endured. The pulse of marble was not one of sound or movement. It was the presence of stillness held perfectly in form, a stillness that would remain long after breath had passed through the place and vanished into dust along the outer rim of the Colosseum, where the arches met the Roman sky in perfect repetition. Niches had been carved, recessed hollows between the columns, quiet alcoves in the rhythm of the stone. These spaces had not been left empty. They had been filled with statues, figures from myth, from history, from the realm of gods and emperors. Some stood in contrapposto grace, others in martial stillness. Their robes hung in carved folds, their eyes cast forward or upward or downward. Their arms bore swords, scrolls, laurel wreaths, but none of them ever spoke. They were made of marble, mostly some of bronze. Most were modeled after earlier works, copies of copies, drawn from the visual memory of Greece, shaped in Roman hands. Their faces were idealized, features smoothed, expressions just shy of human. They stood not to be admired up close, but to be seen at a distance, framing the arches like silent witnesses. They did not demand attention. They simply remained. Each niche had been measured for them precisely, their bases anchored into grooves. The backs curved slightly to catch the light in the right way, and the light did catch them, at least for a time, slipping across their shoulders in the morning, resting on their brows in the afternoon, vanishing from them entirely by dusk. No plaque named them individually. Some were known. Apollo, perhaps, or Hercules. Some were emperors of the Flavian line, their robes carved with the folds of power, their eyes eternally gazing toward the forum. Others were simply ideals, youth, virtue, courage, memory, ideas in stone. They were lifted into place with great care, cradled in ropes, braced with wooden arms, raised by pulley and effort. Workers stood on scaffold beams, guiding them gently into their niches. There were no trumpets for their arrival, just the sound of ropes tightening, wood groaning, and finally, the soft knock of stone against stone. Once placed, they never moved again. They watched, or seemed to. Their gazes were fixed, yet distant. Their sense was felt, yet mute. They were the only inhabitants of the Colosseum who would remain from the first breath to the last. When crowds came and went, when emperors passed, when seasons changed, these statues would endure. And yet, they never spoke. They did not cheer when games began. They did not weep when the sand ran red. They did not stir when the wind shook the rigging of the velarium. They simply stood, Hawaii's frame of Roman ideals, pressed into the bones of the amphitheater. Their silence was not absence, it was intent. For the Colosseum was not just spectacle. It was stagecraft, a theater of appearances. And in this theater, the statues played their part. They were the framing chorus, the unmoving eyes, the moral shadow cast over a city that loved both order and violence. Inside the arena, humans would act. Outside it, gods would walk. At least, that was the design. But stone does not think. Stone does not feel. And these figures, however beautifully made, were not alive. Their silence was not wisdom. It was weight. And in time, many would fall. From earthquake, from weather, from theft. Their arms would break, their faces erode. Some would be taken, others buried beneath centuries of dust, and some would remain headless, nameless, upright still. But in these earliest days now, in this final twilight before the amphitheater opened, they stood whole and still and unknowing. The last light touched their cheeks. The breeze stirred nothing. The world beneath them, not yet awake. And they never spoke, but they saw everything. Beneath the carefully raked sand, beneath the sweep of the seating tiers and the hush of the upper galleries, a different world lay waiting, one of dim corridors, pulleys, trapdoors, and silence. It was the underside of the Colosseum, the unseen half, a maze of purpose. These were the hypogeum, the passages beneath the cheers. By design, they were hidden. No spectator would see them. No sunlight would touch them. And yet, without them, the amphitheater would not function. They were not decoration. They were machine. Here, beneath the polished marble and the crowds that would soon fill the stands, men moved in the half-dark, their torches casting slow arcs of light against vaulted ceilings. The air was different, cooler, dawn, earth's scented. Stone lined the walls. Brick, tough, limestone, arched with care and bound with mortar. Made to last, this substructure had been carved after the rest of the arena neared completion. Not an afterthought, but a later addition cut precisely. Like tunnels in a buried city, it extended the stage vertically, gave depth to the performance. The sand above was no longer a simple floor. It became a surface, beneath which movement stirred. The hypogeum had 2 levels. The lower level held service corridors, rooms for animals, chambers where props could be readied. The upper level aligned with the arena floor. Here, wooden elevators were installed, hoists operated by ropes, wheels, counterweights. At precise moments, they would lift their contents into the light. Cages, platforms, performers, beasts. Each lift was guided by rails. Each door was carved into place with perfect alignment, not for beauty, for timing. The wood, treated with oil and wrapped in iron bands, groaned softly as the system was tested. Carpenters moved through the shafts, tightening ropes, adjusting gears. They had learned their craft from ships and mills. Here, they brought that skill to land. The floor of the hypogeum was alive with quiet preparation. Animal handlers, their tunics stained with straw and dirt, led lions and leopards into waiting pens. The creatures were kept calm with cloths over their eyes, fed sparingly to dull their edge without killing it. No roar echoed now, just the low breath of beasts too long in shadow. Elsewhere, a curved corridor led to the waiting pens for fighters. Not yet gladiators, not yet legend. Now, just men. Their cells were simple. Cool stone, a straw mat, a bench. They waited not for battle, but for rehearsal, for timing, for order, for instruction on how, when, and where to enter. This was not chaos. It was choreography. Above them, the arena was empty. Pound would carry every creak of wood, every soft footstep, every clink of chain echoed upward. The sand might muffle, but the building listened. It remembered sound in layers. The engineers walked these lower corridors slowly. They carried oil lamps. They paused at each junction. They traced diagrams carved in the walls, maintenance marks, pulley charts, load capacities. These were the veins of the structure, the nerves. Each shaft was labeled, each platform numbered, each functioned as part of a whole. There was no grandeur here, no marble, no statues, no sunlight, just brick and sweat and purpose. But in its own way, it was sacred, for this was the realm that made illusion possible. Spectators above would see an animal emerge from the sand as if by magic. They would hear the creak of a gate without knowing where it came from. They would watch warriors rise into light as if from the earth itself. But down here, it was work and breath and timing. Later, drums would signal cues. A door would lift, a platform would rise. But now, only testing, only patience. The hypogeum was nearly ready. A few ropes still needed shortening, a few hinges oiled, but otherwise, the system stood in quiet readiness, like lungs that had never yet drawn full breath. The workers, those few who truly knew these depths, walked the paths one last time. They whispered to each other, checked water flow through narrow drains, tapped the bricks with knuckles to listen for hollowness. One man stopped, adjusted a stone block that had shifted by a hand's width. He wiped his brow, nodded, moved on. They would not be seen, not by the crowds, not by the city, but they would know every moment, every roar, every cheer, every beat of performance began here, in the dark, in the cool, beneath it all. The cheers would come, and the sand would shift, and the trapdoors would open, and from beneath life would rise. The Colosseum was built to echo. Its arches, vaults, and corridors did more than frame the view. They carried sound, upward, outward, inward, again, from the soft hush of sandals on stone to the full-throated cry of 50,000 voices. The amphitheater was a resonant chamber, a vessel for volume, and yet, even in its earliest days, those echoes began to wear not just the stone, but the air itself. For when the crowds arrived on that first day, and the many that followed, they did not come quietly. They came in waves, in groups, in endless procession, filtering through the vomitoria like breath through lungs. Every tier filled, every row taken, voices layered atop voices, laughter stacked on whisper, questions folded into chant, and the building received it all. At first, the sound was thrilling. The crack of a whip, the trumpet's signal, the clatter of hooves on concealed ramps. From the arena floor rose orchestrated chaos. Doors opened, dust flew, figures emerged, animals, warriors, chariots. The shouts of the crowd rose like a tide, surging, crashing, retreating, surging again. The walls reverberated, stone vibrated at the arches, iron rings, affixed to stairwells, trembled slightly. In the hypogeum below, ropes twitched in time, with footsteps above. Workers paused to feel it, this chorus of reaction, of sound turned solid, and the building held at first. But sound, like water, does not pass without mark. Over weeks and months, over years and seasons, the noise carved its own presence into the Colosseum, not as cracks or ruin, not yet, but as tone, as weight. The stairs became smoother, where thousands rushed up them. The walls warmed where hands gripped stone. The corridors took on a low hum, never entirely silent, even when emptied. Residual energy, like breath still caught in the rafters. Some sections responded differently. In the upper tiers, where the poorer citizens sat shoulder to shoulder, the cheers were louder, rougher, full of song and spit and shared emotion. In the lower seats, the noise was measured laughter behind fans, murmured wagers, quiet approval. Between them, the space vibrated in layers, as if the arena contained entire classes of echo, separated by air alone. The Valerium, when extended, responded with flutter. The canvas caught sound, diffused it, sent it scattering like light through mist. When retracted, The openness created a dome of resonance, magnifying cries until they rolled from one end of the oval to the other and back again. And yeah, over time, even the loudest roar faded into something else. Familiarity. The crowd began to know the shape of their own reactions. They knew when to cheer, when to gasp, when to hold breath. And the building, too, adapted. Its stone did not erode, but it softened. Not in texture, but in presence. Like a book often read, like a path often walked. The arena, once pristine, now bore the weathering of use. Tiny chips at the base of columns, scuffs on marble stairs, rope burns in the hypogeum, patina on the bronze railings. These were not flaws. They were memory made visible. The engineers returned, sometimes, not to repair, but to observe. They walked the perimeters. They stood at the center of the arena when it was empty. They listened, and what they heard was no longer silent, nor roar, but something in between. The building had begun to hum, softly, with experience, with everything it had held. The roars came and went. They rose with the sun, peaked in the heat of the day, waned by dusk. Some days brought laughter, others brought weeping. The stone heard it all. Whoa. It did not change shape, but it changed presence. It began to feel full, even in emptiness. A cup that once overflowed, now warm to the touch. That was the weathering of roar, not destruction, but imprint, not collapse, but permanence. Sound had passed through the Colosseum again and again, and in doing so, it left behind something unspoken. Between every stone, beneath every brick, along every vault that curved skyward in the Colosseum's great embrace, there was mortar. Not marble, not the grandeur, not what the eye first sees, but the in between, the hidden, the holding. Mortar was the quietest part of the amphitheater, and yet, without it, the entire monument would fall. It was made from lime and sand, and pozzolana, the volcanic ash that gave Roman concrete its unique strength, even underwater. Simple ingredients, mixed with care, in broad stone basins, stirred with wooden paddles by men whose names were never recorded. The mixture was spread with trowels, fingered into joints, pressed beneath blocks that weighed more than oxen. It dried slowly, but once set, it endured. Now, decades after the Colosseum's first stones had settled into place, the mortar still held. Weathered, yes, darkened by time and touch, but there, firm, solid, reliable, and within it, something else, tiny fragments, flecks of time, not by intention, but by truth. In every batch mixed, there were shavings of wood, crushed bits of pottery, sometimes chips of older buildings repurposed from ruins, a broken amphora, a temple floor, a tile once stepped on by a senator, long buried. The Colosseum did not rise from untouched land. It grew from the remnants of what had been before, the mortar remembered, not consciously, not with feeling, but physically holding fragments that were once whole, now blended into something larger. If the walls could be peeled open, their seams would show a mosaic of the city's discarded past, fused into the weight of its grandest present. And time, in its own quiet way, kept leaving traces, a strand of hair, a sliver of iron, ash from a nearby fire, caught on the wind and folded into wet plaster. These were not stories told. They were stories embedded. The workers, while building, would sometimes pause with their fingers pressed to the joint they had just set, not out of ceremony, but out of habit. It helped to feel the weight, to sense the firmness. But perhaps, too, it was to leave something behind. The pressure of a hand, the oils of skin, a breath exhaled close to the wall, now sealed forever in lime. Flecks of time elsewhere in the structure. Mortar held graffiti scratched in later by visitors, by guards, by spectators. Names, shapes, brief complaints, prayers. One block, high above the south arch, bore the faint carving of a fish, a Christian sign, hidden in plain sight, etched into the plaster when no one was looking. Time was not always loud. Sometimes it ship in the edge of a brick, a stain left by rainwater, a discoloration where a banner had once hung, or the faint outline of a footprint stepped before the floor had fully cured. In these ways, the Colosseum became not just a structure, but a palimpsest, a living surface overwritten again and again, never fully erased, even when clean, even when polished. The mortar remembered, and as the years passed, as emperors came and went, as spectacles raged and subsided, those flecks remained, bound in walls, sealed in stairwells, hidden behind plaques and marble panels, later affixed for glory. Tourists, centuries later, would run their hands across the stone, feeling only smoothness. But beneath that surface, between each joint, were centuries of unnoticed presence, the silence of things never recorded. A cough from a bricklayer, the imprint of a rope held too tightly, the pause of a foot at the top of a scaffold, a drop of sweat falling into the mix. All of it remained, not visible, but there, in the mortar, in the holding, in the hush, between greatness. Because even the grandest moments rely on quiet things, on what hold, on what's between, on the unseen, that never lets go, even now, long after the cheers have faded, after the empire that birthed it has crumbled into dust and memory. The Colosseum remains, not as it once was perfect and new, brimming with sound and light, but as it has become, worn, open to the sky, quiet, and yet standing, no longer a stage, no longer a spectacle, but a vessel still, of time, of presence, of silence. Its arches remain some broken, some whole. Its tiers, some climbed by tourists now, others guarded by birds and weeds. its sand long gone, its sails fallen, its statues lost, but its breath lingers. Walk its corridors, and you will feel it not in the shouts of crowds, but in the hush between your own footsteps, the way your voice softens, the way your thoughts slow. It is not haunted by ghosts, but by the weight of having held so much life. The stone, in places, is smooth, where countless hands once passed. The mortar, flaking, reveals the layers of centuries. The outer walls stand ragged against the sky, like the edge of a torn scroll. And yet, it stands, because what was built here was more than an amphitheater. It was a rhythm, a system, a structure made not just of arches and aisles, but of pause and pattern, a place where engineering met breath, where silence could carry sound, where shadow could hold memory. Not all buildings endure, not all are meant to, but this one built with patience, with stone, with lime and rope, and hand was made to last. And so it has stood through storms, through fire, through war, through centuries of forgetfulness. It has watched cities rise and fall around it. It has held up against time, not unscarred, but unyielding, because it was not built in haste, not for vanity, but for the people, for presence, for permanence. The men who measured it, who carved its stones, who lifted each arch and swept each corridor, they are gone, but their choices remain. Their lines, their hands in the mortar, their patience in the curve of every stair. And so, when we stand within its walls, we do not see ruin. We see resilience. We do not see an ending. We see echo. The Colosseum still holds the weight of sound, still offers its arches to the sun, still opens its corridors to wind. It does not speak. It does not need to. It stands, and in its stillness, so may we. If this guided you gently into rest, let us know below. Sweet dreams.